Hello humans, I'm Yoshiller, and I absolutely love Pokémon. Yeah, what a surprise, right? I don't know if it's even possible for me to express how much this monster collecting franchise means to me. I love just about everything regarding Pokémon, and even if the more modern games are questionable in their quality, I can still find dozens of things to appreciate about them. Video game development certainly isn't easy, and as someone who has played numerous games of varying degrees of functionality, I've gotten into the habit of trying to find at least one positive comment to say about each of them. I find this to be a healthy way of thinking, and it's allowed me to become more appreciative of the gaming industry as a whole. For example, Animal Crossing Amiibo Festival is a rather infamous Wii U game that is often criticized for its core gameplay. The game, even all the way down to a fundamental level, is simply not fun to play due to its inconvenient control scheme. With that in mind, I did find myself enjoying the side modes of Amiibo Festival, and that's primarily because the developers were able to utilize this inconvenient control scheme into something tactical and creative. For some of the modes at least. I found something positive in the game in the way that it used Amiibo. Here, let me try another example. Shadow the Hedgehog. Growing up, Shadow the Hedgehog was at one point my least favorite video game. Now that it's been a few years since I last played it, and now that I've experienced so many other games in that time, I can honestly say that Shadow the Hedgehog isn't all that bad. Oh, it no doubt still has an abundance of problems, but I can still at least respect the ambition of the developers, and the overall dark vibe, though cringy at times, helps this game maintain an identity unlike any other Sonic game, for better or for worse. So I can perform the same exercise when discussing the more controversial Pokémon titles, which are namely the Nintendo Switch releases. For Pokémon Let's Go, I like that you can ride the Pokémon and that you can even fly across the map on some of them. For Sword and Shield, this was the most fun that I ever had competing, and I like that you could choose your stadium background for multiplayer matches. For Legends Arceus, I thoroughly enjoyed navigating the world and catching bulk loads of Pokémon extremely quickly. And for Scarlet and Violet, the designs of Generation 9's Pokémon are some of my favorites ever. Then there's Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. These games were bogged down with criticism and were not reviewed favorably. The two biggest complaints that I kept seeing were made in regards to the game's visual direction, in which every character has a chibi form in the overworld, and how the game feels as though they only do the bare minimum effort of serving as remakes. That is to say, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl are remakes of the Nintendo DS games Diamond and Pearl, and not the Nintendo DS game Pokémon Platinum, meaning that all of the enhancements and improvements that Platinum provided were not at the forefront of development for Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, besides faster swimming speed, I guess. Otherwise, BDSP wound up leaving most players underwhelmed and disappointed. And hey, these are all valid points, and I agree with them. For the most part. But when I go about performing my little positivity exercise to these games, I found that I actually had many positive things to say, and that I admittedly hold these remakes in higher regard than I thought, and probably more than most people. And I had enough positive things to say about these games that I realized I want more of them. I want another game like them. I had so many positive things to say that I thought I should make a video about it, and here we are. But it's also a bit of a unique scenario as well, because it's not as if I absolutely adore these games either. They're far from my favorites, that's for certain. Just my little positivity activity really got my mind going with these games specifically. I don't know if I'd go as far as to call myself a Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl defender, but I am a Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl enjoyer. These games did satisfy a craving for something that's been missing from modern games. It was kind of like comfort food to me. Not to the same extreme as that one scene in Ratatouille, but enough to make me order it again. Yeah, okay, they're still not amazing games, and they're far from my favorite Pokémon titles, but I'm glad that they exist. My main positive comment for BDSP is the sheer fact that they're not trying to be the next grand step for the Pokémon franchise. Rather, they harken back to a simpler time and provide a more straightforward, non-complicated experience than its successors and some of its predecessors. Yes, I wish that these games provided a lot more in the way of content and that they were more in line with their previous Pokémon remakes, but I do also wish that we could see more future Pokémon outings in the same style and presentation of these games. Or, at the very least, I wish that the Pokémon Company would continue to release more mainline games that attempt to stray away from their norms, and consistently present themselves in more varied ways, regardless of whether or not they're familiar or new. I don't necessarily need another chibi-style Pokémon game in the same vein as BDSP, but I would prefer to see the Pokémon Company attempt to alternate between a variety of styles in their core games. I guess the easy way of saying this is, I would really like it if the Pokémon Company had games like this, akin to Sword and Shield and Scarlet and Violet, and had games akin to BDSP released on a regular basis. The big theme of the Pokémon franchise collectively has always been evolution. While the games themselves encourage players to collect and grow with the Pokémon that they obtain along their journeys, the developers behind each project also grow in an effort to overcome new boundaries and advance the overall series appeal. As a player's Pokémon evolve within a game playthrough, so too does the player. And in order to keep providing that same experience, the developers must evolve as well. Think about it. Think about how complex each mechanic in a game can be. Think about how far these Pokémon games have come since their debut on the Game Boy. They've constantly had to make new technology just to make these games exist. The developers of the Nintendo DS made it so that the handheld could connect directly with the Game Boy Advance cartridges in the bottom slot, therefore allowing players to transfer their older Pokémon from their previous Pokémon journeys into new and upcoming games. Like, that still blows my mind. That Pokémon that you obtained from the early 2000s can be transferred all the way up into 2025 releases. And now battles contain all sorts of fun gimmicks like Dynamaxing and Terrestrialization. But I digress. The point is, a lot has changed in the Pokémon franchise over the years. A lot has evolved, and sometimes these are improvements and sometimes they're not. But evolving and growing is inherently good, and all of these additions, whether they be drastic changes to the gameplay and presentation or just some sort of new battle mechanic, have truly changed the shape of the Pokémon franchise since it first debuted. The mainline entries that we see now are way different than how they debuted back in the 90s, for better or for worse. You may be able to still use the same Pokémon that you obtained all those years ago, but the game itself is still going to be fundamentally different just because the franchise has evolved. And those are certainly fun additions and all, but sometimes I don't need all that. Now you might say, but Yoshiller, isn't that what the older Pokemon games are for? How can the Pokemon series evolve without all these enhancements and technological advancements? And to that I would say, wow, what an oddly specific set of questions. And quite the mouthful. But I welcome the conversation, my intelligent viewer. And okay, that's fair. The novelty of each Pokemon game is that each one contains its own world and selection of Pokemon to obtain. As such, there will always be a reason to go back and play specific Pokemon games purely because of their selection of available Pokemon and the methods of obtaining them. And sure, I can go back and play just about any classic Pokemon entry and never grow tired of them. Yet, at the same time, I don't quite see why the Pokemon Company can't also develop games in their old format alongside their new ambitions. In theory, they should be able to have a split in their releases to allow for simultaneous development of a more classic, possibly 2D style or top-down Pokemon game, and a more exploration-focused modern 3D Pokemon game in the same vein as their more recent releases. When Pokemon Legends Arceus released, I had originally thought that maybe this was a new sub-series of the Pokemon franchise. I thought to myself, cool, the core Pokemon games will serve as the more traditional, streamlined games, while this new Legends sub-series will act as a big, open-world exploration type of game. But then, just a month after Legends Arceus released, the next generation of Pokemon titles, Scarlet and Violet, were announced, and it was eventually revealed that their gameplay style would hold many similarities to Legends Arceus, namely the open-world exploration aspect. So, okay, I guess Legends Arceus isn't a sub-series, and that's just the title they chose for that specific game, right? But then, later on in 2024, the Pokemon Company announced Pokemon Legends ZA. So, ultimately, I'm glad that the Pokemon franchise has gone in this ambitious direction of having these huge 3D worlds to explore, and I'm glad that they're incorporating elements from one Pokemon game into the next, and into the next, and into the next. And it does make sense that this is where the franchise would end up now that they are regularly releasing games on more powerful home consoles, as opposed to just smaller handhelds. But what I'm trying to request is that I wish the Pokemon Company would divide their series a bit and attempt to create a new sub-series that leaned more into a classic style, or that they would at least better distinguish their styles of games going forward. Are they all going to just be this big open world exploration type of game? Is that the future of Pokemon? And is that a good or a bad thing? I guess that at the moment we can't really say for certain, but I gotta think that it can't hurt to throw in a little more simplified experiences every now and again too. As other franchises grow more ambitious and experiment with new ways to present themselves, they also remember to utilize their origins to their advantages. We're entering an era in the gaming industry where classic-inspired entries of long-running franchises are welcome and are commonplace. The Legend of Zelda is a series that set a remarkably high bar when it made its leap into 3D back on the Nintendo 64, and it still continues to outdo itself with every subsequent outing. Just as well, the franchise still regularly sees more classic-inspired installments, with each one also receiving high praise and sometimes critical acclaim. And I think that it's fair to compare Pokémon to Zelda since they both started as 2D top-down games with an emphasis on exploring the world, and they both eventually evolved into huge monoliths that still focus on world exploration, but in a different way. Sure, it'd be easy to just dismiss this as saying that Pokemon was never quite the same once it transitioned to 3D, but that'd be dismissing a lot of the appeal and charm that these modern games can still provide. So, if The Legend of Zelda can keep a steady balance between its 2D and 3D releases, or rather its more classic-inspired top-down games and its big exploration-type games, then I believe Pokemon can as well. I feel as though players would have been less harsh on BDSP if this is what released right after Gen 3 or even shortly after Gen 4. But given the context of all the games that released in the interim, those being another 5 generations' worth of games and some massive changes in direction for the franchise, it's only natural that people would be disappointed in the quality of these remakes. Yet, when taken in isolation, they're otherwise functional and straightforward mainline titles that offer a streamlined and simple gameplay experience similarly to that of the first 3 generations, and I find that to be valuable in today's day and age with a franchise as prominent as Pokemon. Plus, I mean, let's be real. A fair share of BDSP's faults can be attributed to Generation 4 as a whole. I mean, honestly, how many of you have gone back and played the original Diamond, Pearl, or Platinum recently? I don't think a lot of people realize just how inconvenient it is to do anything or everything in this game. BDSP does incorporate a lot of modern day mechanics that many players, including myself, have taken for granted. Like Diamond and Pearl requires so many HMs just to traverse the map, and accessing menus and using items is way more time consuming than it needs to be. Just going anywhere and accomplishing any task always feels like a bit of an inconvenience when you compare it to how lightning fast modern day Pokemon games are. Unless we forget how slow battles could be on the Nintendo DS too. But those are all things that have been modified in subsequent Pokemon entries. And now that BDSP is here, tasks such as using HMs and accessing items have all become much more streamlined. However, on the same side of that coin, BDSP also remade and retained a lot of those same inconveniences, and it's because so many modern day mechanics are streamlined that BDSP just feels agitating to play, just like Diamond and Pearl were agitating to play. Still, Diamond and Pearl, and to a lesser extent Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, were intended to cater to a specific type of demographic. Pokemon has always had widespread appeal, but the original Diamond and Pearl seemed to cater more to players that were already Pokemon fans, players that had grown up with the series up to that point, or at least were already knowledgeable on the series mechanics. Whereas Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl were developed in more modern times, where everything is designed to be much more beginner-friendly. The result of that is that Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl just winds up being caught in this middle ground of what newer Pokemon games are and what the original 4th generation was trying to create. It was an experimental generation, and Diamond and Pearl, and even Platinum, wound up feeling a bit more plain as a result. That's especially true when you compare it directly to the following generation, which was noticeably more ambitious. But I guess that's just how it had to be. Whenever multiple games release on the same system, the debut game will most likely be the more experimental one, while all subsequent entries will provide a more fine-tuned experience. Even Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, which were just supposed to be remakes of Gold and Silver but in the Diamond Pearl Platinum style, feel much more ambitious and demonstrate a better understanding of the hardware of the Nintendo DS and the direction of Generation 4 as a whole. This feels like Generation 4 refined. And on that note, it's obviously easy to see why people disliked BDSP when you look at how excellent of remakes that Heart Gold and Soul Silver were to their original counterparts. We all wanted Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl to be the same way, I totally get it. So, I would love for the Pokemon Company to take another swing at making a game like this, but either just join one side or the other. They don't need to walk this line. These newer 3D open world Pokemon games could possibly cater to new Pokemon fans, while these potential 2D style Pokemon games could cater to hardcore fans. All this to say, I trust that if the developers of BDSP were to have another go at making a game in the style of BDSP, then it should be a significant improvement and fans would likely be more accepting of the idea of having more games in this style going forward. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl would serve as a trial run for whatever Pokemon game would come next in this style, just like Diamond and Pearl served as a trial run for what would eventually become Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver and the Generation 5 games. I guess in that regard, both remakes do manage to capture the spirit of their original counterparts, so BDSP managed to capture that experimental feel that Diamond and Pearl had, I guess. But they did lose a bit of the awe and wonder that the original games had due to their leap in technology and innovation of using 2 different screens. But the spirit of the generation remains. I mean, they obviously weren't trying to make this game in the same style as Sword and Shield, right? It was definitely trying to be its own thing, and I can appreciate that. But the point I'm trying to make, and the point of this overall video, is that there is something to be gained from the direction that they did take. Maybe we should have more games in this style and not just cement ourselves in whatever the most recent generation style is. Basically, if they just made another game like this but didn't use the Nintendo DS's hardware limitations as an excuse for less ambitious development here, I think that'd be a perfect secondary, or even tertiary, avenue for future mainline Pokemon entries. Honestly, an easy answer to this? Although easy as a fan and not as a developer, though I highly doubt the Pokemon Company will ever do what I'm about to say, is to just remake the first few generations again for the Switch, just like they did with Pokemon Let's Go. The idea of remaking an old game in order to learn its value and then using the newfound knowledge to push the series further via a new game is a practice that's already been done with a few other game series. I know Crash Bandicoot did this, where the developers remade the first 3 games and then used their newly constructed team and assets to develop a brand new game for the series. I feel as though this is something that the Pokemon Company could do if they ever had interest in releasing more classic games. Frankly, there was once a time when I genuinely thought that the Let's Go games would provide another source of mainline Pokemon games, and I would have gladly had another romp through Johto, Hoenn, and even Sinnoh again. Now it seems more apparent that Let's Go is more of a one-time deal, and Pokemon Go's popularity has kind of fluctuated over the past couple of years, but if they wanted to use the original games as a basis again and construct more games with more of a 2D setup and learn from them and evolve from there, I would be totally supportive of the endeavor. I think both Let's Go and BDSP have already laid out a foundation, so it could be beneficial to use the other older titles as well. They could use those games as foundations and evolve from there, just as they've evolved over the course of the years with their mainline entries. Think of something like Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening to Echoes of Wisdom, or hey, even Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild to Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. So, if the Pokemon Company isn't interested in creating more games in the style of Let's Go, then perhaps they may be more interested in creating games in the style of Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, or more classic-inspired games, remakes or otherwise. Remakes would be an easy answer and a good starting point, but hey, I'll take anything that's classically inspired. Even the Sonic franchise does this, and the fans literally refer to those games as classic Sonic games and modern Sonic games. They both have a place in today's industry. People may prefer one over the other, but it's okay to like both, and it's okay to have both. So, I feel that a split in the Pokemon franchise, potentially referring to more 2D style games as classic Pokemon games and more open world entries as modern Pokemon games, would be appreciated. At least I know I'd appreciate it. And actually, perhaps the Pokemon Company could appreciate and benefit from this as well. It's certainly not a necessity for them or for their fans, but creating more classic titles may provide more good than harm. Because now that the IP has been around for more than 25 years, it's easy to reflect back on each game and see that something was lost over the years. Maybe it's just nostalgia talking, but what I get out of the modern games is not the same as what I get out of the classic games. Don't get me wrong, I'm still a huge Pokemon fanatic and will likely continue to be one for as long as I'm alive. I'll look forward to each new game and will give each one a fair shot and find something positive to say even if the quality is not great. I'm fully aware that the developers are trying to evolve, but will we never be able to experience something the same way as we did in the past? Are these big, ambitious 3D games just the future of the Pokemon series now? I suppose that's all still fine, but I think that an ideal future is one where upcoming releases are also supplemented with more classic outings too. I just want them to grow from what Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl established. I do acknowledge that every Pokemon game poses a unique challenge in its development as it aims to complete, and ideally surpass, the team's visions and goals. It cannot be easy to develop a game for this franchise. I know we may all sit here and dream of one day creating our own official Pokemon and telling our own story in this magical world, but truthfully, there are many different elements that go into creating a mainline entry that I think a lot of people don't really consider. Though, if I were to break things down, I think the simplest way to explain everything would be to divide the Pokemon series into 2 halves. There's the battling half, and there's the exploration half. Both of these halves have grown in so many different ways. Some good, some bad, sometimes fluctuating in quality. Different ideas and visions will forever change the overall interpretation of how these games should be presented, and that naturally means that each game will just feel different. That's not a bad thing, yet it does mean that the 2 halves of Pokemon that I specified can get varying amounts of focus. But with regards to this video, my main intrigue is in the exploration component of these games. That's where I feel a fair deal of the franchise's charm has started to fade away. When it comes to the games, Pokemon is arguably more about the battles than the exploration. Emphasis on arguably. I mean, that's the gameplay, right? That's what makes Pokemon, Pokemon. The battles. Otherwise, it's just a game where you run around a building and step on tiles in hopes of finding a researcher that gives you a Lapras. But I would actually argue that it's the exploration half that really ties Pokemon together and what makes the Pokemon franchise the monolith that it is. And while the recent Pokemon games have provided a fun way of continuing to evolve the franchise with their direction of open world exploration, there is something to be said about the classic Pokemon games providing an exploratory trail where you don't always know where you're going or where the end is or what's up ahead. That's a sense of adventure that was really only conveyed in the older top-down 2D style games. You were solving puzzles, you were getting lost, you were bumping into Pokemon that you didn't know existed. It was a form of entertainment that you were effectively customizing all your own. And hey, I absolutely appreciate all of these modern additions, like seeing wild Pokemon on the map and setting down a marker and figuring out how to get there. And in the developers' pursuit of open world gameplay, these are all great additions, but it does mean that they've stepped away from their previous portrayals of conveying that sense of adventure. And as I've been stating throughout the entirety of this video, is it possible to have both portrayals? Because Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl were able to convey that sense of adventure in a way that Scarlet and Violet couldn't. And moreover, I feel as though Pokemon battles and world exploration blended together better in the older titles than they have in more modern releases. I mean, yes, obviously in the more modern games you can seamlessly transition from the open world into a battle, but battles served a bit of a different purpose back in the older games. Battles were often so fun that you'd sometimes go out of your way just to locate and battle a specific opponent. Or sometimes, battles were an obstacle and you intentionally wanted to avoid them so that you could continue to explore the world at a steady pace. And battles would still serve as significant progression points when you'd fight notable players, such as a rival, a gym leader, or an organization leader. So really, the battles in the Pokemon franchise were always used to elevate the journey. They're codependent with exploring. Therefore, as battles grow, then so too should exploration. Even though the games themselves may not look great, something that BDSP had, purely out of the sake of it being a remake of a mostly 2D title, was a sense of exploration-inducing locations that Sword, Shield, Scarlet, and Violet lacked. Admittedly, the use of an even more dynamic 3D camera in BDSP definitely hindered the game and definitely makes it worse and kind of hurts my overall point of this video. At least, I still felt as though I was running through some fantastical world and felt somewhat rewarded whenever I made it through a cave or a dungeon and reached the next city. Even if it is a remake, the fact that I was still able to feel that has gotta mean something. I may have dreaded going through Mount Coronet a dozen times just to progress the plot, or going through all that snow just to reach Snow Point City, but I still feel as though that's just a part of the journey. I just miss that sense of adventure, and that was better conveyed in these older top-down 2D Pokemon games than more of these modern 3D ones. Ultimately, I hope that the Pokemon Company doesn't learn the wrong lessons from Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. I'd personally be more okay with games in this format, especially if they contained more content. I'd totally be okay if upcoming titles, whether they be remakes or not, don't contain all this complex, huge stuff and all these fancy mechanics. I'm fine just traversing a world in a top-down format with straightforward battles and objectives. Evolution is natural. Evolving as a person or as a team doesn't mean having to forget where you started. There are many different ways to evolve, if the Pokemon themselves are anything to go by. And so as long as the series keeps evolving, I trust that we'll be in good hands. I just think that there's other ways to evolve, you know? Look, I can play the original Pokemon games any day of the week. Like I mentioned earlier, they're comfort food to me. So is it so bad to want more comfort food? Is it so bad to want more of what's familiar? Comfort food has its place, and the classic Pokemon format does too. As other franchises balance their new pursuits while also releasing classic 2D installments, I can only hope that the Pokemon series does the same thing. Regardless, the Pokemon IP will continue to evolve one way or another, and even if the Pokemon Company releases a controversial game, I'll still try to find some positive components in an effort to evolve as well. And so, we've reached the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, please click on the like button or leave a comment. Either of those actions would really help me out. If you enjoyed this video and wish to see more like it, please consider subscribing so that you can stay up to date on all of my latest uploads. You can do so by clicking the big subscribe button, and even better, it's free to subscribe. Otherwise, thank you all so much for your support, and I hope to see you all in the future.